All right, guys. Today we're going to roll through the absolutism timeline. Next to the Enlightenment, I think this is by far the most important timeline. It is a really jam-packed timeline. Okay, so write small and different colors will definitely help for what we're doing. Okay, so we've got timeline number 4, absolutism. Our major key concepts up top. We are obviously going to put the feudal system with a big X through it. Okay, absolutism is going to do more than most other timelines to destroy the old feudal system. Okay, Enlightenment, French Rev are going to tackle it a little bit more as a death blow. But if you think about it, the feudal system is really about the nobles and the priests having power. And if the nobles and priests have power, we're in this old agrarian society. So believe it or not, for the feudal system, having an absolute monarch is actually a benefit. It's an improvement to what we used to have. So I think that's a big point in destroying that. Now, we are going to put, we could put secular rule or secular government. Okay, that sounds ridiculous because most of these absolute monarchs are going to rule by divine right. They're going to use God as the excuse for why they have the ultimate power. But if you think about that, reflect on it, if you know what's coming with Louis XIV, he might use divine right as an excuse to rule. But everything he does behind the scenes about having a cabinet, about having a centralized overall bureaucracy, about running every individual thing, professionalizing the military, everything that he does, right? That's a real competent way to rule. And it's the reason France becomes the all-powerful country for a time under Louis XIV. A very, very smart way of going about rule. And the last word we'll put up here is Machiavellian, or just Machiavelli. Because this is kind of ultimately what Machiavelli is talking about, is having a person that rules in line with only their power, nothing else standing in their way. Okay. Over here, I am going to make a list of all the things that we're going to talk about kind of in order. First one is going to be military/merchants. Okay. And we're going to put one box all the way up at the top, right underneath that cluster box. We're going to write about 2 lines of things, but give me a little box from about here, early 1600s into 1700s, and put down here military. And the word, why this era? Because we need to add to our timeline. We need to put right here, 1618 to 1648, something we already talked about. That is the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War is in many ways the first large European war. It's country versus countries. And for that reason, the type of army that we see develop is, instead of that old feudal army where the nobles kind of rule, the nobles have the knights that they run and all this other junk, we instead have a professional. We have a professional army, right? It is not knights out in the countryside where, it used to be the king had to go to the nobles and ask them, hey, can I borrow your knight so that I can go and fight this battle? And if the nobles said no, then the king didn't have an army. That put a lot of hands in the power of the noble. Well, we're going to remove that, because if you're going to fight a massive war against a whole nother country, you can't do it with knights on horseback. You need to do it with a professional army. And the words you might see with that are permanent, trained, and what do they put? They put weapons, right? But you could say armed, okay? Now, the issue, that's great, right? We have all the men with the same training, with the same uniforms, with the same weapon that's probably getting to the point of being mass-produced. But the problem with having large-scale professional armies is that those things require 2 things. Number one, they require money, okay? They are the single most expensive thing that countries have, right? Wars are the most expensive thing that a country can do, and the army is the biggest part of that. So in order to get that money, the ultimate point is that we are going to have a more centralized state, which means we are going to have a government with a larger bureaucracy, right? More and more control in the hands of the government. That centralized king is going to run this 300,000 person army. In order to get all that money, they are going to collect taxes. For a lot of these absolute monarchs, this is the first path that they use to becoming an absolute monarch, right? Usually when you go stand in front of the nobles, you say, hey, as a king, I really want to do this. And the nobles say, it's still the feudal system. No, I'm going to do what I want. Well, in this case, you can stand up and say with some authority, hey, if we don't build a bigger army, we're all going to die. We're going to get invaded by Prussia or Russia or Austria, whoever's on the edge of our country. So what I need you to do is, instead of spending $100 to your knights or whatever else, I need you to write me a check for $100 every year. I'm going to take this tax money, I'm going to build a bigger army, and we're going to have a better defense. Right? That's a good stepping stone for kings to become more powerful. Next up, we have merchants. Right, we have a new class of people. Write it real small up top here. We have a new class of people that are gaining power, gaining influence. They are bankers. They are guilds. They are guild managers. They are merchants. They are, we know, the new elite. We met them first during the Renaissance, but here they're going to play a much, much, much bigger role, right? We're not going to end up putting it on here because of space, but these are the guys who are going to become the intendants. They want to become the intendants because they're just new elite. They're not nobles. They don't have protected classes. They don't have all the rights and responsibilities and voting that comes with being an official card-carrying noble. So they're going to ask the king, and the king will say, I'll make you a noble, but you've got to do something for me, all right? So this new elite, they are going to gain in Gold Star. If you remember, what were the French ones called? Okay, the French, these new elite, they will be called the nobles of the robe. The nobles of the robe. The nobles of the sword are the old-timey nobles back then from the feudal system that have had their nobility for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, whereas the nobles of the robe newly earned it. A couple other things I want to put on this timeline just for reference is we're going to have about 1517 to the late 1500s. Let's put the Protestant Reformation. Or Protestant and Catholic Reformation is fine. Should highlight both of those. And then finally, let's also put the person who kind of leads us into the age of absolutism. She is not considered an absolute monarch herself, but we should mention her nonetheless. It is Elizabeth the First. Elizabeth the First. And she ruled from 1558 to 1603. She's on another timeline. We know all about her, but let's highlight her here. All right. I'm done with that. We're going to go to the next color. Next color is going to be the Holy Roman Empire. Holy Roman Empire doesn't get to have a taste of absolutism because instead of having absolutism, they're essentially going to fall apart. And we're going to draw this line. This is the only thing above the line in the center here. We're going to draw a line right here at the end of the 30 Years' War. The end of the 30 Years' War was 1648. 1648, so 1618 to 1648 was the 30 Years' War. The end of the war is the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia is the agreement that ended it all. Now, the reason the 30 Years' War was significant, you know it without even writing it down. The 30 Years' War was the last large-scale religious war. It's the last time that we fought at a massive scale, primarily Protestants versus Catholics. Because after this, we are going to fight because we are nations, because we are French versus Germany versus Russia versus England, right? This is the end of this era, kind of the dying breed of this type of war. So it's also, we'll put the end of the medieval Catholic Church. Just end of the medieval Catholic Church, right? It's the end of the priest, the Pope really having his army, having a super influence over all the other kings. After this moment, the kings are going to put themselves and their country before even religion. We saw during this war that Cardinal Richelieu, the guy who was in charge of France, but is also a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church, he ends up joining part of the 30 Years' War on the side of the Protestants, fighting against Catholics. And the reason he does it is because that outcome, Protestants beating the Catholics in this case, would help France become stronger and have more influence. So he is putting his country in front of his religion. So it's the end of the medieval church. It's also the end of the Holy Roman Empire. This is the downfall, especially of the Habsburgs, but it's really the end formally of the Holy Roman Empire. After that, we are going to have the Prussian region and Prussian rulers emerge more and more strongly, especially up there where the Protestant Reformation was. And the remaining Habsburgs are going to have their power diminish down into just the Austrian Empire, then the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and then just Austria, and then boom, eventually they are gone. So if the 30 Years' War is the end, the other thing I want to mention for this end of the Holy Roman Empire, where does it really start? Well, if they're the Holy Roman Empire, it really starts with the Protestant Reformation right here in 1517. But we'll be more specific and just say it really starts with 1555, which during the Protestant Reformation, you would remember, is the Peace of Augsburg. Peace of Augsburg, allowing Protestantism officially as a religion in the Holy Roman Empire, essentially beginning this downfall of the Holy Roman Empire and their control. Okay, next country, the big one. Number 3, we're going to do France. Now, Louis XIV is hopefully a guy I can do a general review for you because we studied him so well in class that you're going to remember most of this, and hopefully you remember even more than what I go over. But the date for Louis XIV, remember, is 1715. That's when he dies. Not an Uber date, not a 1517, not a 1789, not an 1871, but one I've repeated enough, I hope you understand. Louis XIV dying in 1715 tells you that the age of absolutism and everything that goes along with it is somewhere middle to late 1600s. So 1715, write real small here, okay? You can use about half of the space for Louis XIV, but I need the other half, all right? So this is Louis XIV. He is born and comes to be in the middle of, he was born and rises to power in the middle 1600s. This is Louis XIV. And if you ever write the name of Louis XIV, before you go any further, you are going to write his nickname, the Sun King. The Sun King represents everything about him, right? The sun is the ultimate power in the universe. The sun sees all parts of the kingdom. It immediately has its voice heard or its sight seen all over the kingdom. It's the perfect nickname for him. And if you ever write Louis XIV, just immediately write comma Sun King because you're going to use it to answer whatever question is asked. We do want to mention, though, before Louis XIV comes to power, we have the guys that come before him. And yes, Louis XIII comes before him, but the more famous one is Cardinal Richelieu. And the reason Cardinal Richelieu is significant is because he tries to centralize, but we'll use him to highlight the problem. The problem with centralizing power at this time is because of the nobles. The nobles are able to stop most of the power by the king or its regents in their track. And it's true in a lot of countries, right? But in France also, because what formally gives the nobles power, well, A, they own all the land. They run most of the businesses. They used to run the army, but they're losing that power over the course of these monarchs. But also you remember the Estates General is a thing with the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. And whatever the parliament is in whatever country we were talking about, it's what gives the nobles a lot of formal power. A lot of countries have a parliament that technically can make laws and whatnot, along with or opposed to the king. The king, in absolutism, needs to put himself above these nobles, above these absolute power. We talked about Cardinal Richelieu doing things like joining the 30 Years' War and making France better. We talked about Cardinal Richelieu. Remember, like he confiscates, he tears down, he stops using some of the old medieval castles because he says it's because, we don't use them anymore. We're not going to spend tax money to run them. But the real reason is those old-timey nobles, living in the castle, big old fat bellies with a pile of gold in the basement, not doing anything. If you tear down their castles, you're tearing down their control, their wealth, their stuff like that. But the other thing we're going to mention for Cardinal Richelieu, the big thing is, at the end of his reign and in the beginning of Louis XIV, when he was, I believe, just 4 years old, there was an event in Paris that really set in motion a lot of what Louis XIV is going to do. It's called the Fronde. The Fronde, if you remember, was a riot. It starts as a bread riot, a revolt by the peasants And they revolt because they are starving. They are hungry. They want food. And Louis XIV is caught up in the middle of this, a very scary event for anybody, especially a 4-year-old who was seemingly at some level the target of this anger. Well, luckily for world history, for French people, as Louis XIV grows up, he correctly doesn't blame the starving peasants, ultimately, for rioting, right? He doesn't blame the starving people for trying to get more food or change the system. He blames the nobles because they are ultimately the people in control, taxing the lower classes, harboring grain, raising prices for their own greed. So he sets about his life work to basically overcome their power. So what do we need to know about Louis XIV? I'll write a little bigger. I'm going to use a little bit more space here than you should use. Again, you can use about half of the space underneath your line. So Louis XIV and the Sun King. After you write Sun King, the next thing you're going to write, it's always going to be part of your answer about Louis XIV. The biggest way he rules is divine right. So, divine right, the idea that God selected you to rule. It's a very powerful idea if you can get your constituents to believe in it. And he does. Like, we're not going to write it up here, but one of the things he does is if you want people to believe that God selected you, one of the arguments you should make is that there's only one religion. So you revoke that Edict of Nantes from the Protestant Reformation, and you allow only one religion again. It also puts the church, the priests on your side, the Catholic ones, so they start spouting off in church about how you as king is the one true guy. They tell all the people, hey, God told me that he picked this king to be power. His ultimate thing that we always say about Louis XIV is he ultimately seduces the nobles. Okay, he gets the nobles under his control. And the biggest thing besides divine right, I know there's a lot of biggest things for Louis XIV, but we'll pull a star there, is the Palace of Versailles. Versailles plays a couple different functions. Number one, he uses it to control the nobles. By requiring the nobles to come to Versailles, he's able to keep an eye on them, he's able to control them, and they are not out in his country, out in the cities or out in the countrysides, basically doing what they want, collecting their own taxes, running their own laws. When he has them at Versailles, then who's out in the countryside running things? Well, the intendants, the newly hired, new elite nobles that are completely dependent on the king's blessing for their power, they go out and run the country as the nobles are distracted at the Palace of Versailles. It's a smart thing. We talked about the King's Rising, Corvée, the plays. We looked at Palace of Versailles. You understand all this. But the other point of the Palace of Versailles is the building of this pyramid. Do you remember? We had a second pyramid for Louis XIV. This second pyramid wasn't the pyramid of the feudal system. It was instead, we called it the pyramid of bureaucracy. The pyramid of bureaucracy. That's a fancy word for saying government. All the things that go into government to run a country. The simple fact of the matter is, if you want to be a single divine right ruler, you need a bigger government to actually run things, right? If you want to create one large professional army, you need to have all the generals under your control. You need to have somebody who's in charge of organizing industry and construction of weapons, somebody who's in charge of uniform, somebody who's in charge of teaching strategy to lower level officers, right? You simply need a bigger government to run something of that size. And so what he does at the Palace of Versailles is he puts all his government in one spot. That allows him to raise his government, make it bigger so he can control more stuff, but more importantly, it allows him to run everything from that one building. The other buzzword we'll put here is centralized power. Remember, one of the smart things Louis XIV does that I tell you to do when you're an absolute monarch or a totalitarian dictator is don't actually make all the decisions yourself. Have the smart people around you. Have your cabinet, right? People you trust. Have your big nerd friend who's good at math tell you what you should do with the economy, okay? Have your best guy at war games tell you how you should run the military and take their advice. You can give your final approval. You can tell the world that it is your command, so that's why it's getting done as the divine right absolute monarch, but use that cabinet. Louis XIV does. The guys that come after him aren't, which is why, and let's put it on the timeline in the same color. 1789 is also on this timeline, right? That's the French Revolution. Ultimately, the ultimate revolt against that triangle of the feudal system, an ultimate revocation of a divine right, absolute monarch, and the nobles in control. So this building up of bureaucracy, the seducing the nobles, getting them out of the way, centralizing power. We know 1,000 different things for Louis XIV that he does. All right. He also does really smart deficit spending. How do you intelligently spend a whole bunch of money you don't have? Well, you spend it on something that will return a greater investment. That's called investing. In his case, he does it on infrastructure. But there is one frowny face for Louis XIV. There is one frowny face for Louis XIV. And that is at the very end of his reign, right before he dies and goes away, he fights a war. Now, wars can be a good thing. All right. If you fight a war and you win, it might increase your power, but really it increases your territory. You collect more taxes, you collect more money. There, it increases your power. But the worst thing you can do is lose, because you spend a whole bunch of money, you lose respect, but most importantly, you lose the money and get nothing back. That war he ends up fighting. If you remember, the King of Spain dies. And Louis XIV, and all this absolute monarch, divine right, been doing it for 70 years at this point. He says, you know what? I should also rule Spain. I think God wants me to rule that country. All right. Well, who has a problem with that? Again, he's upsetting the balance of power. We did forget one thing. It's okay if you don't go back or you had it in a different color, but I forget if I said it out loud, but we did the end of the 30 Years' War, completely switching gears. We did the end of the 30 Years' War. We said it was the last large-scale religious war. Well, that means from now on, what are wars going to be fought over? Well, they're going to be fought over nationalism, and they're going to be fought country to country, but the real issue is they're being fought now. It's over the balance of power. Think about it. Most of the wars we fight from this point on in European history are all about the balance of power. When Napoleon gets too much power in the hands of France and he gets too big of an army, he doesn't fight against one country. All of Europe tries to stop him. When Hitler expands his borders, he doesn't fight against one country. All of Europe will try to stop him. Right? When Germany, before Hitler, tried to expand his boundaries, all of Europe is going to try. Anyway, so what happens here is Louis XIV tries to expand his borders. Well, who has a problem with France also ruling Spain? Well, the Netherlands, Belgium, Portugal, England, Spain, Germany. Every country is going to fight against Spain in this war of Spanish succession. And Louis XIV is not going to win. So in this, he tried to upset the balance of power. All right. That is France. Let's do our next color. And this is going to be Peter the Great. So, Peter the Great. So, underneath Louis XIV, I don't have that much space. I want you to cut that space in half. I need about an inch for Peter the Great and an inch for England. I'm going to erase this and use this space because I'm too old to bend down and write that low. So we're just going to write it like it's under Louis XIV. And why do you know it's right under Louis XIV, right on top of it? Because if I asked you when Peter the Great died, you would guess, right? You wouldn't know. It's not something I ever taught you. But if you remember, Louis XIV dies in 1715. Just have that in your head for Peter the Great. Bam, 100%. Peter the Great actually died in 1725, but you'll never need to know that difference. So right about the same time, we have Peter the Great. Peter the Great's my favorite person in history. I spent a whole day talking about him, but we can summarize him super easily because if you ever get a question about Peter the Great, the answer is going to be one word and then 3 explanation points about it. The one word is Peter the Great is considered the great westernizer of Russia. Put a big star and write westernizer. So what does Peter the Great actually do to westernize his country, right? Well, you remember when he rises to power, before we write official stuff, He's a relatively intelligent young man. His parents, understanding that Russia needs a really good king, they bring in Western educators. They bring in Western teachers like English teachers and French teachers. They bring them into the palace to teach Peter like the kids in Western Europe. The more developed, the better off Western Europe learn. And then when Peter the Great gets to high school and college age, remember he goes on that big trip through Europe where he goes and he meets with all the monarchs and he gets to see the way they run the country and the way. And remember that his favorite country was the Netherlands, where he spent almost 6 months working in the docks for building ships. That's something that Russia never has. And when he comes back from this trip and he steps off the boat, his first command as king is one of his more famous things. And just write the word beards. And the reason Beards is on the list, and Beards is the great westernizer, because what he's doing is the reason that nobles had beards back then is because the church required it. The church officially or unofficially required that all the rich men would basically grow a beard like Jesus Christ did. This is the Russian Orthodox Church at the time. And Peter the Great said, no. We're going to look more like like English and French people, the more advanced communities. So you're all going to shave your beards. The reason it's significant is because this is Peter the Great saying, hey, your king is above your religion now, right? I'm not saying anything crazy. I'm not saying you shouldn't go to church. I'm not saying you shouldn't go to communion. I'm not saying, Jesus Christ isn't Lord and Savior. I'm just saying you need to shave your beards, all right? So people have to start choosing the king over religion. And that goes further, right? Beards is not just religion. He also changes the clothing from the old-timey like robes to more modern dress. He'll modernize the military, which you could put down for every single absolute monarch modernizing the military. But beards is the big one. The other one, both of the other two revolve around St. Petersburg. And the two reasons that St. Petersburg is significant is A, it's used to seduce the nobles. It's used to get the nobles away from the countryside, away from their castles, away from their traditional power. So to remember that, I just want you to write Versailles. Right? Peter the Great uses all of St. Petersburg as his palace of Versailles. He has a palace there, but he centralizes his government. He builds a bigger and bigger bureaucracy. He gets the nobles out of the way of the countryside, blah, blah, blah. The other reason St. Petersburg is significant is because it's the first time Russia has a truly functional warm water port. Okay. And perhaps the biggest reason Russia's behind the rest of Europe, the biggest reason that Russia is still super stuck in the feudal system is because they're really disconnected from Europe. It sounds weird because they obviously share a huge border with Europe, but if you look at a map, their cities are far into Russia. And there's just no quick way to get from one city in Russia into Prussia, the Holy Roman Empire, into France or England. They're really far away. Whereas if they had a port, the exchange of goods, ideas, books, everything would grow at an exponential rate. And he's kind of right. Peter the Great's warm water port in St. Petersburg is perhaps his greatest improvement. All right. Now, the person that comes after Peter the Great, we talked about very, very infrequently, and there's not too much you need to know about her, but just write Catherine the Great. To be honest, if you get any questions about Catherine the Great, just think about what would Peter do as the great westernizer. And most of the questions about Catherine the Great, then you're going to be able to answer without too much trouble. All right, next color, if you will. And this is England. And we won't actually put it, but we kind of put a star next to English name because the title of this timeline is Absolutism, okay? But that's not accurate for all parts of this, okay? Because while all of these countries are going to fall into absolutism, England never does, right? And the reason is there's a bunch of reasons, but the biggest one is this. England is a much more established governmental system, all right? The biggest reason is they already fought this battle with the king a long time ago. All right, you remember, I think it's 1215, there was a king that got too aggressive, he wanted to take too much power, and their Congress, their States General, they made the king sign the Magna Carta, which is a document that essentially says, ultimately, the king cannot overrule this part of parliament. It's some kind of limitations on the king. So now when a king comes along and says, no, 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 I want to be an absolute monarch, England has a little bit more established system on how to defend against it. Well, why is England suddenly worried about it? Well, you remember Elizabeth dies right here in 1603. And you remember why that is a problem, especially for England? Well, the reason, of course, is because of Elizabeth's nickname. Right? Elizabeth was known as the Virgin Queen. The reason she was called the Virgin Queen is because she never married and therefore she never raised an heir, especially and obviously a male heir to the throne, right, for a clear line of succession. So since she never had kids, when she died, England's in a bit of a struggle because even though they are a limited monarchy, there is restrictions on the king. They still exist in a monarchy and they need a king to rule their country. So they look all around the UK, and luckily for them, they do find a ruling family that they can have. And they are, of course, the Stuarts. So let's write England up here. And we can almost split this in half. There's kind of two eras. So over here, England, Queen Elizabeth dies, and England hires the Stuarts. Remember their names? James and Charles. James Charles, Charles James. They're all the Stuarts. And the Stuarts, if you remember, when they get crowned king on the very first day that I believe James was first, James Stuart stands in front of Parliament. He says, and I quote, "There are no limitations which stand against a divinely appointed king." And what he's saying is, hey, you may be Parliament, you may be elected, but there is nothing you can do that can, should, or would limit my power. I am God wants me to rule. There are no limits on my power. Right? He is claiming his absolute divine right claim to the throne. And all the Parliament rolls their eyes and says, hey, we just did this, 500 years ago. Are we really going to do this again? And the Stuarts do the one thing Louis XIV did. Remember how Louis XIV dealt with the Estates General? There is one kind of obscure law for the Estates General and for Parliament, which says in order to actually make laws officially, the king shows up and ceremoniously bangs the gavel. Right? He can't do anything. He can't make any decisions. This is, the elected body. But he gets to bang the gavel and open it. Well, if the king never bangs the gavel, then that Parliament is never officially in session. So Louis XIV never calls the Estates General. And the way he gets away with it is because you can kind of get away with never calling Parliament as long as you never raise taxes. As long as people are always getting wealthier and wealthier and making more and more money, they generally don't care what you do, especially rich people. They're not really going to care as long as their wealth goes up. So that's what the Stuarts do. They just never banged the gavel and they never met Parliament. Now, the English Parliament is way more angry than the French Estates General, and they try a bunch of different things to try and get Parliament to be called, but the Stuarts never do it. Now, it never sparks anything major because the Stuarts never raise taxes. Well, then there's a revolt in the northern cities, a religious conflict in the 1600s. The Stuarts do bang that gavel, and they demand that Parliament gives them money. And in that moment, Parliament says no. So the Stuarts say, fine, we're going to go raise our own army. The king goes and raises their own army. Parliament says, we can't let you have an army and us not have an army. So Parliament raises their own army. And we end up, of course, with the English Civil War. The English Civil War is fought between the parliamentarians and the Roundheads. It's fought between Parliament and their army and the king and his army. And what happens is the winners, of course, is Parliament. The kings are defeated. The king, I think it's Charles at this time, gets his head chopped off. And then all of a sudden, England has to look around for a ruler. So they just say, all right, well, I'm just going to have the guy in charge of the army gets to rule the country now. His name was Oliver Cromwell. And that's the last thing on this lower line that we're going to write. And for Cromwell, you can just write a frowny face. Do you remember why Cromwell wasn't popular? He doesn't argue he's a divinely appointed king. He does kind of argue he's in charge of the military, so it's a protectorate. He really should have a lot of power. You remember why he was really, really unpopular? The reason is because he was a Puritan. Maybe the most strict of the Protestant groups, right? No dancing, no reading unless it was for the Bible, no theaters, no plays, nothing that symbolized the devil. You're not allowed to have wedding rings. The king doesn't wear crowns. So he was just kind of a real big radical. Well, he dies they get so angry at him, they dig his body back up and behead him, and then stick it on a spike, remember, and then forget about it. But he dies. His son is like, hey, maybe I could be power, in charge now. And all of Europe or all of England is like, no, we don't want any more Cromwells. So we need a leader. Well, they end up with the Stuarts. Okay, they don't have any better options, so they just call up the next set of Stuarts. I believe it's Charles II now, and they're like, hey, Charles Stuart, if we let you come back and be king, will you be a good and decent king? And Charles is like, yeah. And then he shows up, he gets crowned king, and he says, hey, guys, I think I should be an absolute monarch. And so England goes back and forth like this for a while. Charles dies, we get James II, and we are building and building and building and building and building towards a second English Civil War. But luckily, Parliament, and especially James II Stuart, realizes that a second civil war is really deadly for the country, and the king might lose his head just like his great-grandfather had. So instead, we have a bloodless exchange of power. James II Stuart gives up his crown, he abdicates, and he goes away, and Parliament lets him leave as long as he promises not to come back. This is called the Glorious Revolution. Okay, it is a bloodless exchange of power where we go from the king in power to now it's back to Parliament. All right, which is great. The first thing Parliament does is they pass a new set of laws called the English Bill of Rights. Right, the English Bill of Rights, passed in the 1600s. Before we even get to our Enlightenment timeline, England's passing that. They're, again, ahead of the curve. That's why they're going to be more powerful, more stable than most other European countries. And then the problem for England, of course, is that they have to look around. They need a new ruling family. They finally look to their little brother, the Netherlands, and they end up with Orange, the Orange family. That is William and Mary. William and Mary Orange take over the country. Last color, we do need to talk before I forget, back to the English color. There are two men writing during this era that we care about, okay? Over here, writing during the English Civil War, and therefore probably pretty angry, probably views society as pretty evil, and especially people. That is Thomas Hobbes. So, Thomas Hobbes writes a book called Leviathan. And in Leviathan, he says that people are naturally, do you remember that? People are naturally greedy. Right? He did a thought experiment, right? And again, this is a guy writing during a civil war, writing at brother on brother crime. And what Hobbes says is like, hey, what if we took people and took away all their politics, all their religion, all their family, all of society, and just stuck them in the middle of the woods? What would that state of nature be like? Do you remember the three words he used to describe that state of nature? He said it would be nasty, brutish, and short. Because people are naturally greedy. And again, you don't need to memorize all these facts about Hobbes, but like, if you get a question that I've seen on the AP test, what kind of government do you think Hobbes wants? Do you think he trusts a democracy? Right? Do you think he trusts maybe even a monarchy, right, which goes down by bloodline? He argues the whole point of the Leviathan is this mythical giant creature. He argues that we need a singular kind of absolute dictator, right, to run society to protect against the greedy nature of people. And the guy on the other side, the guy writing during the Glorious Revolution, during the peaceful exchange of power, we won't talk about him right now because he jumpstarts the Enlightenment, the new age of people. That is John Locke. John Locke and his natural rights. One last color, real quickly. We do need to talk a little bit about the Holy Roman Empire. Now, I already highlighted the fact that the Holy Roman Empire is essentially on its downhill right here, okay? The Holy Roman Empire is really the big loser in the 30 Years' War. Protestants are kind of the big winner. The Habsburgs in charge of the Holy Roman, they're going to lose control of the northern territories, kind of the Prussian and Germanic regions, in no small part because they chose Catholicism, and Catholicism is getting weaker and weaker, and Protestantism in that region is banding people together. So we are seeing the end of the Holy Roman Empire. They're going to shrink down into the Austrian Empire. But I do want to mention, so we have Holy Roman Empire. We're just going to write 1700s to 1800s. Right, so after the 30 Years' War, we could put it on this part of the timeline, but I got space over here. What happens here is instead of they don't get into the Enlightenment. Right, it's my last point. They don't get into absolutism until well into the 1700s, because in the Eastern Europe they're way behind everybody else. They don't get into Enlightenment until they don't get into absolutism until the 1700s. But by that time, as you can guess, we've gone into the Enlightenment era. So what the Holy Roman Empire does in that Central Eastern Europe and a little bit of Russia, you can argue, what we do is we combine the two. And we end up with, do you remember, enlightened monarchs? These enlightened monarchs, think about what characteristics an enlightened monarch has, all right? What kind of things would they want, would they allow in their country? They still have complete control. They've done it to kick the nobles out, but they're going to try and be a good and decent king to their people. So what kind of things do we have here? Well, let's just tell you. Religious toleration, right? Less censorship. Other ones you can write down is like more education, especially Western education. Less torture is a key concept, right? They disallow all these things. But I think less censorship is in religious toleration fit in with everything we talked about. So the examples that you should know. There's two countries. Prussia, they have two examples. Frederick William II. And Frederick William I. So sorry. And Frederick II. And then the other country is Austria. They have one leader who's a little more famous than the other two, and that is Maria Theresa. And the very last thing that I want on this timeline, I don't care where you put it, is if you look, we have England has solidified itself with the Glorious Revolution, the English Bill of Rights, a limited a constitutional monarchy that's going to serve them well for a while. France jumps ahead in the 1700s, but in the 1600s, but in 1715, Louis XIV dies. And after Louis XIV dies, Louis XV, Louis XVI, they're not nearly as good, and we get the French Rev at the end. One of the signs that we're seeing the shift, that France is on its way down and England has survived this and come out ahead, is in 1756 to 1763, we fight the 7 Years' War. In America, it's known as the French and Indian War, but I highlight what it's known as in America because, so you remember, the 7 Years' War is fought essentially over colonies. It is in many ways considered the first true world war. And England does defeat France in that. That causes a whole bunch of problems for France in the future until we get to the French Rev. Thank you for listening. That's it. Good night.